Right in front of me stands the R12 S. In this video we'll have an introduction, a ride review and also take a closer look at the whole retro theme and why it still has such a strong appeal. Stay tuned! At the EICMA and Intermode, the R12 S was the absolute eye-catcher at the BMW stand. Crowds of people gathered around admiring this machine. And I think that was totally justified. Here in Spain we now have the chance to ride it, probably as the first media outlet as far as I know. When I first saw it at EICMA on tour and later at Intermode, there were crowds around it. You could barely get close to the BMW stand to see the R12 S, and I totally get why. It's a prime example of the R12 series, truly stunning. And at the same time, it's a modern motorcycle. It comes with cornering ABS, lean angle sensitive traction control, cruise control, heated grips, hill start assist, riding modes and even cornering lights. So it's fully loaded, yet BMW has wrapped this R12 S in such a classic look. That makes me wonder, why does this still have such an appeal? Why does this classic look, the whole retro theme, still resonate so strongly with people? Why is it such a magnet that, according to my information, pre-orders for this bike have already pushed production into 2025? I want to take a step back here, away from the motorcycle world and look at the bigger picture. Because no matter where you turn, retro is everywhere. Think about vinyl records from the 50s and 60s. They've made a huge comeback. As in fashion, we're constantly revisiting past decades, and right now the 80s and 90s are back in style. Even in digital media like video games, take Minecraft for example, with its massive pixels, retro aesthetics are everywhere. So I started wondering why that is and did a bit of research. In simple psychological terms, memories of the past help people cope with difficult or uncertain times. Whether economic crises, the COVID pandemic or whatever else we've been through recently, there's this idea that everything was better in the past and that feeling plays a role here. Designers, whether of motorcycles or other products, tap into this longing for comfort and security to create desire. But there's also another side to it, especially in the case of the R12 S. Historical models serve as inspiration for BMW's designers. In this case, it's the legendary R90S, which caused a sensation in the 70s, but more on that later. One fundamental reason why we find rounded shapes appealing, like the circular shape behind me, is simply rooted in human nature. Rounded shapes are familiar to us from the natural world. Think of fruits or living creatures. There aren't many sharp edges in nature, so we instinctively recognize them as safe and familiar. Sharp or angular shapes, on the other hand, signal potential danger to early humans. They might indicate a cliff edge, a thorn that could injure you, or something hazardous. Psychology also plays a role. Rounded shapes appear more inviting, calming and in tune with our natural desire for harmony. And as humans, we are wired to seek harmony. Then there's the neuroscience aspect. Scientists studying the brain have found that rounded shapes directly activate our brain's reward system, whereas angular shapes tend to be perceived as threatening or dangerous. Lastly, cultural associations come into play. Circles are symbols of balance and harmony. Just think of yin and yang or the circular patterns of mandalas. As I mentioned in the intro, the R12 S takes its inspiration from the famous BMW R90 S, which was produced between 1973 and 1976 and was considered the first true supersport motorcycle. From today's perspective, that might seem a bit amusing. It had just 67 HP with an air-cooled 900cc engine, but for its time, it featured some impressive innovations that made it a super sport bike back then. One of these was the small front fairing, which introduced aerodynamics into BMW motorcycles for the first time. In the past, fairings and windshields were usually added as aftermarket parts by specialists, just like in the early days of automobiles in the 1910s and 20s, where the bodywork often came from a different manufacturer than the engine and chassis. The same was true for motorcycles. Most fairings were added later. But with the R90S, BMW was one of the first manufacturers to include a fairing as standard. What else was special? For the first time it featured a disc brake, right away a dual disc setup at the front. Back then drum brakes were still the standard on the front wheel, but the R90S changed that, coming equipped with proper disc brakes. It was also at the forefront in terms of performance. A top speed of nearly 200 kilometers per hour and an acceleration of 0 to 100 kilometers per hour in 4.8 seconds. Serious numbers for its time. Of course, it wasn't just the performance that made the R90S the flagship of the 6 Series and a true classic, it was the design. The paintwork, which already came in this shade of orange back then and has now been revived on the R12S, as well as the silver grey option, still looks stunning today. Naturally, the seat is a bit bulkier than what we're used to on modern bikes. Even so, there are some beautifully preserved examples out there, though they fetch premium prices on the used market. I'll link you to some listings where you can see what an R90S is going for these days. Compared to that, the new R12S almost seems like a bargain. But can the R12S live up to its predecessor, and is it an instant classic? That's exactly what I'm about to find out for you, right from the saddle. Alright, enough talk about retro vibes, classic styling and good looks. I'm now mapping out the route with Kalimoto, which I'm taking on the R12S. Hill climb control has done its job, and naturally the S in R12S raises certain expectations for sportiness. After all, the R90S was the top model of its time in BMW's 6 Series. Now, we're going to see whether the R12S in the R9T lineup meets modern standards for a sporty motorcycle. In terms of brakes and suspension, it shares the same setup as the R9T. And here BMW has gone for a bit of understatement, because if you take a closer look at the rear suspension, that innocent looking white monoshock actually houses Öhlins components. At the front you've got Mazzocchi forks, but BMW keeps things discreet, no branding, just letting the quality speak for itself. So we're dealing with some top tier components here. And I have to say, from the saddle, it really performs beautifully. The suspension response is great, but as you might have noticed in that last left-hand corner, the R9T suffers a bit in terms of lean angle clearance due to its comfortable upright seating position. And for a sport model, that's definitely on the lower side. So if you take the sporty appearance of this bike seriously, you might find the limited lean angle a bit disappointing. Other than that, the engine is an absolute powerhouse, even after all these years. I've known this engine for ages. It first appeared with the original R1200 GS generation. It's still air and oil cooled, and as for the sound, which by the way I'm recording separately with a microphone to capture it properly, it remains distinctly boxer-like. It's not something you'd complain about, but when you compare it to bikes like the Triumph Speed Twin 1200 RS, which we also had with us, well, let's just say there are motorcycles out there that sound even better. All right, time to turn around here. There's a town coming up and we don't want to disturb anyone. That 50 kilometers per hour speed sign was a clear warning for me. But back to the sound, BMW's chrome twin exhaust system is definitely a bold statement in terms of looks. One area where BMW did choose to make a statement is with the braking system. The Brembo setup with twin front discs does a perfect job. There's nothing to complain about. It fits the bike like a glove. Now, let's see. By shifting my weight a bit with some hang-off, I can increase the lean angle. And yes, you can definitely ride this bike in a sporty manner. You might be wondering why I'm in road mode. The bike also has dynamic and rain modes, but I feel like BMW didn't quite nail the tuning of dynamic mode. It often has a bit too much of a harsh on-off throttle response, which feels a bit abrupt. Road mode, on the other hand, still gives you the full 109 horsepower, so I prefer to stick with that. Another thing that isn't perfectly tuned is the quick shifter, and I suspect that's partly down to the nature of this engine. BMW hasn't quite perfected it here. There's always a bit of a jolt when rolling off the throttle to shift down, a noticeable jerk that runs through the whole bike, and when you're in a low load state, you really feel it. It's that typical boxer quirk, slightly imperfect. Other than that, the riding position itself is very comfortable. A seat height of 795 millimeters isn't particularly challenging, and thanks to the relatively low mounted foot pegs, even at my height of 1.87 meters, I can move around on the bike comfortably. In terms of riding impressions, well, weight is still a factor. BMW lists it at around 220 kilogram. Unlike in Wiener Neustadt, we couldn't verify that here in Spain because, well, I don't have a calibrated scale. So let's just take their word for it. As always with boxer-powered BMWs, they're never lightweight machines, and you do feel that when stationary. But as soon as you get moving, those kilos seem to disappear. Even in tight switchbacks like the ones coming up soon, it handles well. The wide tank, which is also absolutely stunning to look at, provides great knee grip. So ergonomically, it's really well suited for taller riders. But Amelie is also here with me. She'll be sharing her thoughts later. I think she got along well with the bike too. It's really only when stopped that you feel its heft. But once you're flowing through these corners, it just works. In the end, BMW has left nothing to be criticized here. Whether in Munich or Berlin, where this bike is built, it's simply a joy to ride. So, all in all, it's a very well-rounded package. Though of course not exactly a cheap one. Before wrapping up, I also took the bike for a spin on the motorway, and I wanted to share my impressions. The windscreen in front of me, while visually imposing, doesn't actually take a huge amount of pressure off the chest. It's more of an aesthetic feature, but compared to having no wind protection at all, it's still better than nothing. Since we also have the Triumph with us, which is a fully naked bike, the difference is noticeable. As for fuel consumption, we refueled yesterday after a 210 kilometers ride. That stretch was, of course, a bit more spirited than a relaxed cruise might be. But just to give you an idea, after 200 kilometers, we filled up with 11 liters and a bit, which works out to a fuel consumption of around 5.5 liters per 100 kilometers. And while we're taking in the view of this beautiful castle, I'd say that's the figure you should expect when riding the bike in a sporty manner. However, I'm sure you could get it under 5 liters per 100 kilometers with a more economical riding style and lower revs. With that, I'm signing off from the saddle. I'll let the sound speak for itself for a moment and check back in with you shortly. Yes, Amelie, we've now stopped here at the edge of this beautiful road. Earlier, I said that retro somehow evokes a feeling of security. It stands for the good old days when people felt safe. Now, you belong to a generation that never had to experience Germany's really tough times. I'm not even talking about World War II. There was still a lot that happened up until reunification. You never had to experience hunger, and neither did I, thankfully. But does the whole retro theme still resonate with you, and if so, why?
Absolutely, that was actually the first thing that came to mind. I love vintage fashion and everything related to it, like vinyl records and anything that falls into that category. I've never really thought about why that is, but I do think it conveys a sense of comfort. There's something cozy about it, but I also feel that even though it's a fully modern motorcycle, if I compare a retro look bike to, say, the brand new Z900 SE, I get the feeling, and some people might disagree with me here, that retro has more character. I don't know, it just speaks to you in a completely different way. If I had to choose, I'd definitely lean towards the retro look.
So more the Z900 RS than the Z900. The retro version we had with us on the Balkan Rally. Yeah. We also had the BMW R12 with us on the Balkan Rally, another derivative from this lineup. It came with quite a few differences. The engine was tuned a bit differently with only 95 HP, just 2 riding modes. And of course, the seating position was much more cruiser-like. And now here we are at the sporty end of the fun spectrum. How do you like the R12 S? Is this more your style, or do you feel more at home on the R12?
I really love the sporty riding position. That's something I really enjoy. We've already talked about how the tank recesses provide a great knee grip, making you feel properly integrated into the bike. And overall, I do really like the R12 S. But since I now have this direct comparison, I have to say that I actually preferred the mapping on the R12 we had on the Balkan Rally. That bike had rock and roll as riding modes, and I liked them a lot more. Here, even in road mode, not to mention dynamic, I really didn't get on with the throttle response at all. And in corners, when you make small throttle adjustments, it's not smooth. A lot happens at once, and that kind of threw me off a bit, which was a shame.
You already mentioned the noticeably more active riding position on the R12S. The handlebars felt quite wide to me, but you're quite a bit shorter than I am, I think around 1.76 meters. Still, you seem to handle it well even when maneuvering at a standstill. So the weight of the bike wasn't an issue for you?
No, it's definitely an adjustment if you haven't ridden many bigger and heavier bikes before. But here I especially felt that the steering angle is really good. So there were no issues when maneuvering, even for a lighter rider like me.
No, actually in dynamic mode I really felt it. Since you mentioned the mapping earlier, it was just too rough in my opinion, which I already mentioned while riding. But I do think this engine is well tuned for its 109 horsepower. It handles that power just fine. And if I can quickly compare it to the R12 again, the difference is noticeable at the top end. With the R12 you get that cruiser feeling. It's like it's ready to shift into the next gear halfway through the rev range. But here, if you really want to push it, you can make full use of the power this engine delivers. So in that sense, it's a fitting engine for this bike. Now, coming back to the whole retro theme, my last question for you, how do you think they've incorporated it, just in terms of looks? Do you like it as it is, or would you change anything? Is this already your dream bike?
I think out of all the motorcycles I've had the chance to test so far, this one is at least in my top 2. I really like it a lot. My dad actually had an R90 in that brushed aluminum version sitting in the garage, and I already loved that bike. This one has a similar silhouette, but with the windscreen, the tail section, and of course the two-tone paint scheme, it stands out. There are also so many small details. And the twin exhaust at the rear, it all comes together really, really well. At the same time, it still has that modern touch. So kudos to BMW, very well done.
After an extended ride on this beautiful route, which, as I mentioned, I tracked with Kalimoto, I've come to a conclusion about the BMW R12 S. At first glance, it looks like a dream bike, but there are a few areas where you notice that while a high price is being asked, not quite as much money seems to have gone into production. What do I mean by that? Specifically, almost all the add-on parts are made of plastic. This includes the front fender and the rear side covers. The paintwork is two-tone, which is nice, but if you take a closer look, the elegant red pinstripe lines are actually just stickers that have been clear-coated over. And honestly, for a proud price of nearly 26,000 in Austria, I feel like BMW could have gone that extra mile. Even the heat shield on the side isn't metal but plastic. There are quite a few details that don't quite align with the premium image BMW is projecting with the R12 S or the price tag suggests. In terms of riding experience though, there's very little to complain about. Many things have been done really well, like the analog round dials and the chrome headers at the front, which develop that beautiful blue tint over time. That really adds a touch of class. The solo seat with its quilted stitching doesn't just look great, it's actually comfortable too. If it were mine, I'd also remove the right-hand passenger footrest bracket, which BMW seems to have forgotten to take off here in Spain. Because from a distance, visually, this bike is truly at an extremely high level. There's not much I'd want to change. So, my final verdict, it's a successful modern reinterpretation of the legendary R90S. You just might not want to inspect every little detail too closely, but it rides like a modern machine. It's a fantastic everyday bike, and you can easily take it on longer trips. Of course, luggage options for the rear might be a challenge at some point. If you're considering buying one, take it out and enjoy it. It would be great to see plenty of these out on the roads. According to my information, even though this isn't a limited edition model, demand is currently outstripping supply. So if you want one, you might have to act fast. One last note about the tires. The Metzeler M9RR is a great fit, offering plenty of sporty reserves while still delivering reasonable mileage. I've already demonstrated its lean angle capabilities during the ride, and it holds up well. All in all, a well-rounded package at a very premium price. Now it's over to you. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think of the BMW R12 S, what your take is on retro motorcycles in general, and whether my amateur psychological theories from the start of the video made any sense, or if they're just nonsense. With that, I'm signing off from our Spanish outpost. Adios, muchachos.